Hi everyone. It's Wednesday, April 1st, 2020, and I want to give you a evidence-based update on the pandemic. I would like to try to answer the question why the United States is having such a hard time of it compared to other countries in the advanced industrialized world. So here we go. Okay, so as you can see here, the White House task force projects 100,000 to 240,000 deaths in the US. This is with mitigation efforts, meaning that it includes all the social distancing efforts being done by states, all the quarantines being done, and so forth. Some of the models project that without those mitigation efforts, the deaths would be upwards of 1.5 to 2.2 million people. So this site is one I use frequently. They began to host a site on the coronavirus back in January, and I've been following it since. The site gives you the cases worldwide here and the number of deaths, and also the number of people who have recovered, meaning that they are free from illness and no longer test positive. You can see by these graphs here the total cases. We've got the case statistics here. What we can see is that the growth of the cases in the world have been exponential. If we turn to the logarithmic scale, where you can see everywhere that this line has a rise to it, like here and here, it means that the growth rate is exponential at that point. If it flattens out like this, there's still growth, but it is arithmetic, meaning 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 versus 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, and so forth. Back to the top, if we look at the death rates, you see a similar picture. You can see under the logarithmic scale here that the death rates are increasing exponentially as of late. And in fact, they've always been increasing exponentially since the very beginning of the outbreak. Let's take a look at yesterday's data. Today's data is incomplete. The United States had the most cases per day. You can sort by most cases here, and far more than second place. And also, the United States had the greatest number of deaths in the world as well, 912. If you look at this site here, which is Covid19 Info.live, and also a very useful site, you can take a look at some of the percentages here. The case fatality rates overall in the world is 5% rate. So you arrive at that number by dividing the number of deaths by the confirmed cases. Now, of course, this information is not completely accurate because there is a lot of unknowns. We don't know if this is the total number of cases. It could be far more than that. The confirmed cases here are limited by the amount of testing, and a lot of countries are not testing very well. And the death rates, there are some cases where deaths aren't being recorded, places like China and Iran in particular, but other places as well. So when we have all of the numbers, we'll be able to have a much more accurate sense of what the case fatality rate is. That won't happen until after the pandemic is pretty much done with. This number should be taken lightly at this point. There's some differences, of course. You see the US is 2.2% case fatality, whereas Italy is almost 12%. Early on, the number of cases tends to spike upwards very quickly, and it takes a while for the number of deaths to catch up to that, making this number a little bit lower. As social distancing measures start to work, first the number of cases drops, like it has in Italy, and eventually, maybe a few weeks later, 2, 3, 4 weeks, the number of cases should begin to decline as well. And that makes a big difference in these numbers. Now, let's take a look at this chart here. This is COVID COVID-19 cases by country. Here's the United States. So this is the doubling every 2 days line. This is the doubling every 3 days line. Right now, the United States cases is doubling about 2.5 days. And compare that to China, where in China it was doubling every 2 days. And then they began to institute very extreme measures to stop people from contacting and socializing and being exposed to each other. And eventually it led to a decline, and the number of cases is now increasing very, very slowly in China. If you look at the number of deaths, here's the United States. You can see it's doubling somewhere between 2 and 3 days. And in China, you see again the same pattern where it has basically come under control. However, some people question the numbers. There's uncertainty as whether or not China is really reporting all of the numbers. Underlying health disparities here make all the difference in the world. If you look at this article by NPR, what it shows is that people that have particular conditions are much more likely to be admitted to the ICU, intensive care, and go under a ventilator than people without any pre-existing condition. If anyone has any of these conditions, they have to be extremely careful to not get exposed to this virus. This data comes from the United States. This one comes from China. And you see the same thing. People who don't have any pre-existing conditions fare far much, much better than people who do. Here, cardiovascular disease came out on top, diabetes second, and respiratory diseases third. They also include age over 60 here as a factor. Taking into account a lot of different social and health conditions, the CDC has come out with the vulnerability index. It combines demographic and socioeconomic factors like poverty and so forth to see which places in the country are most vulnerable, most at risk. So the question becomes, why is the United States so much higher than the rest of the country? Why are we seeing these numbers here? 24,000 plus new cases a day, 900 plus deaths a day, far more really than other countries. And we can expect this number to rise dramatically in the next few days as well. Again, there's a lag period. So we see this increase really quickly first. As you can see, it has far outpaced the other countries. And the same thing will probably happen in terms of deaths. Well, one of the reasons for it is because the United States simply did not test early. If you look at this chart, in the early days, the tests per million people in the United States was a tiny, tiny amount compared to other countries. You can see how much more other countries have tested. And so this created an opportunity for this virus to spread unchecked. And when you test, you can then isolate people. You can capture early cases, isolate them very quickly, and hold down the spread. And the other reason is because we still haven't fully isolated ourselves. Yes, 3/4 of all Americans have been ordered to stay at home, and that's really good. It's very positive, but there's still too many people that haven't. So if you look at the map here, the stay at home order doesn't apply to the entire nation. It's per state. And that means there's a lot of gaps in our defense system against this virus. How many people are staying at home? That's really the question. And until we really crack down and discipline ourselves to fully isolate and fully socially distance, these numbers will continue to rise. Other countries have done this when they've experienced the increase in cases. So let's return to this cases by country chart that I showed you before. Take a look at Singapore and also take a look at Japan. Both of these nations managed to keep their cases from doubling between every week and every 2 weeks rather than between every 2 days and every 3 days. And the reason why they were able to do that is because they began to do social isolation very early. If you look at South Korea, they weren't quite as early as these other two countries, but once their numbers began to rise rapidly, then they began a very extreme testing measures and also were able to get control of this epidemic by following up every case and being extremely meticulous about it. Countries like Italy, it took them longer. They basically began to do the same thing in South Korea, but they didn't begin to do it until much later on. And in the United States, again, we are pretty much lagging behind. You can start to see here that the doubling rate is beginning to slow just a little bit, but it's happening at a much later time than these other countries, which means there's a major backlog of cases that have built up before the social isolation started, and those cases are going to continue to propagate this disease. That's the reason why the United States is going to really see one of the worst, if not the worst, rates of any advanced industrialized countries in the world. The United States is a pretty big country, and so I think it's going to be affected very differently from place to place. If you take a look at these two maps I showed you earlier, one of them showing the index of vulnerability on the left, and the other on the right showing the places that are not yet social distancing as they should. You can see that the South looks like it's going to have a rough time of it. On balance, I would say there's really good news that a lot of the country has begun to take social distancing and stay-at-home measures very seriously. That's good to see, and it will make a big difference in keeping the death rate down. However, the United States really is not doing as well as it could be, and there are big holes in the way that we're treating this pandemic, and that's going to, in some places in particular, create a lot more deaths than were necessary. So that's the update for today, and I will continue to do these updates once a week and keep you informed in the best way I can. If you have any questions, please let me know. Post them here on YouTube, or if you're in my class, you can post them in the discussion boards that I set up for this particular subject. Take care, everyone.